absolutely wild as Verne Gagne's all-star wrestling goes coast to coast and continent to continent. The greatest wrestlers in the world.
He may be an apprentice carpenter, but I guarantee you he is a seasoned ring veteran.
I've been hit with bar stools, bar rags, barmaids.
I'm talking to you.
They're scared that Hulkamania's still running wild. Oh, yeah. I got a big fat wife and 9 kids at home, and I gotta feed them.
And take a look at Jesse the Body in real life.
Open your hand once, if you would.
You want to see it?
This is absolutely unbelievable. Totally, completely out of control.
He's coming in over the top. Hey! Look out!
You are darn right, darn tootin', darn skippy that we are out of control. Look at us. We are wild and crazy guys on the preeminent podcast of the AWA Unleashed.
Boy, that for some reason the words just did not match the expression. Oh boy.
We've had some comments about the beginning of our show, so I'm trying to dial it back.
Oh, please.
You mean the free show that they get to watch?
Yes.
That one there.
The some of the slackers.
Yeah. So here's what I'm going to do at the beginning. If you're not a Patreon supporter, please support us. Please buy our shit. Okay. Now, let's get into the program.
Boy, that'll tee it up.
So does that appease the one?
I think it does. What's going on, boys?
We are equal opportunity shit givers, are we not?
Oh my god!
Including the three of us.
Yeah, exactly.
I was looking at that show open again, and and this show is going to be about 1965, and the Crusher was huge in the area back then. What in the world? You brought it up, Chris. A bar rag. You're a 252-pound guy from Milwaukee, a former bricklayer, and you're hit in the head with a bar rag. It was like a 3rd-degree bar rag injury, or
maybe the bricklayer and a bar rag are connected. I don't know. Or
have you ever had a wet bar rag thrown at you?
I know you have.
Well, maybe once or twice.
I'm surprised you went with the words "thrown at you."
But
hey, we lost that guy now. See, we're joking around, and we lost him. He's
Mission
gone.
accomplished.
Yeah. Oh boy!
But a drenched wet bar rag with a combination of some scotch, some beer, some vodka, not ringed out.
You're describing yourself now.
Ringed out? Ringed out?
Not ringed out.
Wrung out?
Ringed out, wrung out. What am I, a fucking English major?
Hi, everybody. Oh man,
it's not going to hurt, but it's also not pleasant.
Thank you, Dr. Chupik.
Yes,
anytime. I'm the rug doctor.
Let me say, hey, let me say this about the show today. It's going to be fun in the sense that I think it's going to be a learning experience for a lot of us. We're going to go with another feature, as you guys said. We're going to talk about the year 1965. 2 quick things, though. Yes, if you're not a member, we would like you to become a member of our Patreon. For $4.99, we've got a few more people that have signed up over the past week. Really awesome. You get our watch-alongs. You get our live chat at the end of the month. You get the exclusive interviews, which, by the way, I'm looking to confirm one that we're going to do right after this that I think you guys are really going to enjoy. So we've got all of those. We've also got TeePublic, where you can get all of our merchandise, our T-shirts, bar rags, barmaids, bar stools. You can put a picture of Chupik's face and you can sit on that. And, Joe would enjoy that if you sat on his face. I think that's pretty much about it.
Boy, we crashed right through the barrier today, Pally.
I want to
There you
make sure anybody that doesn't like the beginning, we're gonna just like Motley Crue, don't go away mad, just go away.
Perfect.
All
Way to
right.
go. Nicely done.
Thank you. Thank you.
Nicely
I love
done,
it.
pal.
Yeah. Besides, I had a long night last night with the Twins post game, so I'm kind of feeling a little goofy this morning. But let's get into it, guys. 5.5 minutes in. Let's get into 1965. I'm gonna let you guys kind of have the conversation because I know we got a lot of visuals. Hopefully, you guys are going to enjoy it. And I'm gonna bounce out. I'm gonna let you two fellas take it. So go ahead, Slick Mick, and
The one thing that I would say, pardon me, Joe. The one thing I would say for me specifically for 1965, I was entering the teenage years, young fan, and the AWA was about 5 years in, and it was a tremendous year for the AWA. It's the first really cognitive memories I have of attending the matches on a regular basis. And a lot of stuff was going on in the AWA back in 1965. It was a pivotal year.
What I'm really looking forward to on this one is 1965 was the year I was born. So obviously I have no recollections of that time period. All I know about it is from working in the business and having to do my little research, maybe seeing a clip or two. So this is going to be like a history lesson for me. And so I'm really looking forward to it. But let's right off the bat. So who was on top? Who are the champs? Both single champs and tag team champs in 1965.
Interesting that you say that. It was a completely different era, guys, where championships meant something. And I say that with all due respect to the Roman Reigns and Cody Rhodes of the world. Championships could change at house shows. They didn't have to change on it was a non-existent pay-per-view. But who was on top? That guy right there. And he was the first champion in 1965. This was a carryover from October of 1964, where he had beaten Verne Gagne. Mad Dog Vachon carried the championship until a little bit earlier on in the year 1965. But the dog, again, had gone from a preliminary wrestler about a year prior to the world's heavyweight champion in the AWA in 1965. And what you're looking at right there, that was the classic Mad Dog Vachon promo wrapped in chains back in the early 1960s. I think he eventually chewed through them, but that was the dog. He was the first champion of that year. And then here's a guy. Here's a guy who had a championship that year, and it was actually the Crusher. Crusher, of course, as we look back at 1965, you're going to see an awful lot of the Crusher and an awful lot of not a lot of Verne Gagne, but you're going to see Harley Race, Larry Hennig. You're going to see guys like that have their name consistently brought up because they were the regular main eventers all over the AWA.
Was he the Crusher by that point, or was he still Crusher Lazowski?
Well, I think by that point he was the Crusher. Okay. He came in as Crusher Lazowski, and they dropped the Lazowski pretty quickly. But he was the Crusher, and so he had turned babyface by the time he beat Mad Dog Vachon for the championship in 1965. But towards the end of the year, the dog regained the championship. So as you're looking at it, you got the Crusher and the dog, and there was one other guy that was in there who held the championship for all of 1 week in 1965, and that was the mighty Igor Dick Garza. He held the championship in Omaha, and we have mentioned before that Omaha kind of did their own thing. They were an AWA affiliate. A lot of big AWA matches went on in Omaha. But as far as championship changes and so forth, they kind of did their own thing. Fritz von Erich beat Verne Gagne in 1963 for a championship in Omaha. Joe Dusek, the promoter down there, again, they were kind of an entity all unto themselves. But Mighty Igor, history will show, 1 week AWA champ.
Were the Omaha titles for the AWA recognized here? I was a little confused about that.
It was the AWA championships that were recognized in Omaha. So Omaha was part of the AWA territory, but on occasion they would do their own thing, and they would, with the blessing of the AWA hierarchy, obviously, more so for the Omaha market, but they would change a championship, for a week or two. And
what about other cities, Mick? Did other cities do that too, or
no?
Was it okay?
Omaha was really I guess you can say Chicago occasionally did their own thing, in terms of talent roster. In terms of the championships, it was strictly AWA. I would say, thinking back on it, unless I'm mistaken, Omaha was really the only city that did their own thing. And here's an example of a guy who wrestled extensively in Omaha, but then came up to the Twin Cities area and wrestled for a short time in the AWA. That's Tim Woods, Mr. Wrestling, the guy who eventually became the Mass Mr. Wrestling #1, tremendous collegiate wrestler. Tim Woods was on top in the Omaha territory, but again, he was dealing specifically with his Omaha-related roster until he came up to Minneapolis.
So we've discussed the heavyweight championship. How about the tag team?
Tag team championship. That was, again, such a limited exchange of championships.
Yeah, I love that picture.
Isn't this beautiful? The Crusher and Dick the Bruiser were tag team champions from 1964. Again, this is a carryover championship. They came to the AWA. Crusher had turned babyface in January of 1965, I believe, was when Crusher turned face. And there was another tag team on the horizon that was kind of running havoc in the AWA back then, and that was the tag team of Harley Race and Larry Hennig. And the Crusher and the Bruiser were the fan favorites, clearly. They came in look at Harley with the old skunk gimmick going there in the hair. I love that shot.
That doesn't even look like Harley Race.
Isn't that something? I mean, Harley was probably 23, 24 years old at this point. And the feud between Hennig and Race and Crusher and Bruiser is probably one of the most legendary tag team feuds in the AWA. January 30th, 1965, Larry Hennig and Harley Race defeated the Crusher and Dick the Bruiser. Stunningly, the fans were absolutely blown away. Larry and Harley won the tag team championship from Crusher and Bruiser, and that was pretty much it until a little bit later on in the spring, out of nowhere, this tag team of Verne Gagne and the Crusher. And Joe, we've said this so many times before. It was the old story about the arch enemies bearing the hatchet for a common enemy, which happened to be Larry Hennig and Harley Race. And Verne and Crusher defeated Larry and Harley to win the AWA Tag Team Championship, but this was a very, very short reign. It's not even a transitional thing. It was just putting Verne and Crusher on top for a little while, and Harley and Larry regained the championship before the end of the year and carried it into 1966.
Why Verne and not Bruiser?
I don't know what the situation was there. I do know that Bruiser was kind of in and out of the territory at that point. He was kind of floating in and out. And, of course, Mad Dog had the singles championship. So Verne is without a belt at this point. And this is 1965. you can't have Verne without a belt for any length of time, and whether it was for his spandex pants or whatever, Verne had to have a belt. So, and I was there at the matches. The Crusher and Verne went over huge. The crowd went absolutely apeshit. But again, a short-lived title reign. Larry and Harley won the championship back.
So if we're talking about 65, this is still like the kayfabe era. I mean,
Yes.
it seemed like the AWA was we know Verne was very protective of kayfabe, right?
He absolutely was. All the old school promoters were.
Okay.
You know, I mean, Verne was indicative of the way it was back then, whether you're talking about Sam Muchnick in St. Louis or Eddie Graham down in Tampa, whoever it might be. Yeah, kayfabe was absolutely alive and well. And if you were fortunate, you got a little news clip that at a championship had changed hands someplace. But no, it was totally kayfabe.
Well, I remember even into the 80s when the Pioneer Press would post the results in the sports page. That's not something that's done anymore. Might be in the variety section.
No, you know what's interesting about that, Joe, and I know we got a lot to talk about here, but
well, and then I got one more follow-up after this, you guys.
Oh, sure. I would call the results in. Wally would have me call the results into the Minneapolis and St. Paul papers, and I'd get some sports writer at midnight. You know, I got the rest of, hold on a minute. And, and as I've given him the results, okay. So then the next day in the paper, a guy's name would be completely misspelled or misinterpreted. They weren't paying any attention whatsoever, but at least wrestling got its, half inch in the papers.
It was there.
Well, and little do we know, people still misspell wrestling to this day.
Imagine. Yeah.
Zabisco is one of those names that always got butchered. He wasn't around here in 65, but yeah.
Or like Bobby Heenan would say about Leo Namalini, his name reads like an eye chart. So
Zabisco, those are great crackers, by the way. I love the Zabisco crackers. Those are really good. So 65. You said the AWA. When did it start in 60?
It started officially the storyline with Pat O'Connor, et cetera, et cetera. AWA August of 1960 was the inception.
Okay, so in terms of like the lineage of some of the other territories, like where was the AWA? Could you tell me where was it viewed in terms of like being a powerhouse, like a serious promotion in terms of like the star power compared to some of the other territories?
The AWA, even before it was AWA, the Minneapolis territory was a powerhouse.
Okay.
In terms of roster, in terms of storylines, in terms of crowd intensity, whatever, you're a powerhouse. In terms of being a power broker on the national scene in 1965, not so much, because that was probably still the NWA. That was probably still number one. The WWWF got started in 1963, so they're on the map now with Bruno Sammartino. So I don't think the AWA was necessarily number one, but they were starting to make inroads.
How about the TV product then? Because I know that a lot of it was, and sorry to kind of sidebar here, guys. I know that we got a lot to get to. The TV product, I just got a confirmation from our upcoming guest, so we're good right after this. So, sorry, I kind of got sidetracked here. So the TV product, I know that the TV was big during that days, but they also focused on the shows. What was the TV like?
TV was, as we said, for me, it was glory days. It was the days of the TV studio. No pay-per-views. No shilling for a pay-per-view down the road. None of the backstage vignettes.
No rag sheets.
Oh, thank God. No rag sheets. Nothing like that.
Bar rag sheets?
Sorry, well, stop. No, that's fine. Like Joe has mentioned on previous telecasts or podcasts, we had that one camera shoot above the ring. Maybe sometimes they would go to that 2-camera shoot, this little intimate studio in front of 100, 150 people. But that's all you needed. You didn't need an 18,000 seat arena with pyro and everything else to get your angles over. Either there was an angle, somebody getting attacked in the interview area, or maybe, once every couple of months, a guy would get attacked in the ring, but that would carry the feud over for a couple of months. It wasn't crash television where something was happening every week. Boom, boom, boom. You open with the interview and you go to the blah, blah, blah for the first half hour of the show. It was wrestling. And that's the big difference.
And it was live.
Yes.
Live television. And sadly, and I know Verne expressed this to me years later, sadly, they didn't record those and keep those for prosperity, for history. If they exist, it's very few and far between. Let's move on, Mitch. We've talked about the AWA Heavyweight Championship and the Tag Team Championship. Were there any other championships? I know later on the AWA had the British Empire Championship, the Light Heavyweight Championship, but one that and the third one I really want to talk about is, was there anything recognized for the ladies?
There was, in fact. And when I first started wrestling, yeah, look at me. Yeah, you got that right. That's like Haystack Calhoun when he first went on his diet. What do
you were the before or after picture in the weight loss with Haystacks?
Both, unfortunately.
Nick was the original luchador.
I was the guy that all got the sand kicked in his face, and all those old beach ads. Kay Noble was probably, as we like to say, the preeminent female wrestler back in the mid-1960s. Prior to that, in the territory days, Penny Banner, June Byers, early on, they were the recognized ladies on top. But Kay Noble, who was a Hall of Fame wrestler in her own right, one of the toughest ladies ever to get into the ring. She was married at one time to former AWA wrestler Doug Gilbert. And Kay was no nonsense. If there was a riot going on in a building, she would come out of the locker room and she would beat the shit out of any guy that got in her way. She didn't care. Kay Noble was fearless. So Kay was I think she was the poster girl for the AWA Ladies Championship at the time.
You brought up Doug Gilbert. He was part with, was it Steinborn, Mr. High and Mr. Low?
Doug Gilbert and Dick Steinborn. Doug Gilbert was the Mr. High of that combination. Dick Steinborn was Mr. Low. In later years, Larry Hennig would refer to himself and Kurt Hennig as Mr. High and Mr. Low, but Larry always said, I do ground transportation, more than Kurt. But and Doug Gilbert later on teamed up with Reggie Parks, both in the Omaha area and Minneapolis. So yeah, Doug was a player here in the AWA, certainly.
So you had brought up when we're talking about the World Championship about how titles didn't change as often. Now, you had talked about the 1 week run and so forth, but it really was coveted. Outside of those few blips, when you won the championship, typically you would have quite a run for it.
Yeah, there's no question. I mean, early on in the show here today, I talked about those interim championship changes. That was kind of a rarity in the AWA, and most often it was just to pop a house or like Omaha did their own thing. But I'll give you an example. Charlotte Flair, however many times, 14, 15 times ladies champion. How many years has she been in the business? It's just... If you had a championship, I believe Verne held the title, from 1960 to 1964. Certainly as you go later on in the years, Bockwinkel held the title for a number of years. But back then, as you said, not only in the AWA, Joe, but everywhere, a championship was coveted. If you got a Lou Thez to come to your town, if you got a Jack Briscoe in the NWA, or later on a Harley Race or whoever, that was a big, big deal. You were getting the world champion, and it meant something. The storyline in the AWA, the big storyline in the early 1960s, was Mad Dog Vachon avoiding giving Verne Gagne a championship rematch. Verne was always on the chase. There's a great example of the Crusher and Mad Dog Vachon back in the 1960s.
Vachon with an E.
With an E. And Mad Dog took so many beatings over the years, he actually lost the E on the end of his name. Crusher might have been the guy that actually removed the E from the name with a bar rag. But to your point, the championship meant something. And if you had a Verne Gagne in one territory, Lou Thez in another one, and Bruno Sammartino in another one, this was really a big deal. And there weren't this plethora of championships, 24/7 championship and intercontinental and this and this and this. And, you get caught up in the merry-go-round of championships. And then somebody comes out that's been in the business for 3 years and they're a 14-time world champion. It night and day difference to what the title meant back then.
Well, you when they provide the 14-time or 8-time world champion, whatever, I would have to say, let's take a look at how long somebody had a championship.
Exactly.
For Verne, probably would have been about 12, 15 years total. Just guessing, don't quote me on the exact time, but it was a longer period of time that you had the championship. Bruno had the famous run with the WWF for so many years until I think it was Khosrow or Iron Sheik beat him, right?
Actually, it was Ivan Koloff.
Oh, yeah,
Ivan Koloff.
Yep, you were correct.
But Bruno had the title from 63 to 71. There's an 8-year reign. Nowadays, they don't even talk about in terms of years. It's in terms of days. So if you're a Roman Reigns, you held the title for 1,717 days. How many times did you defend it in that time frame? In the 17, maybe 12, maybe 15 times. But again, it's not years anymore, it's days. So the days of the championship meaning something certainly different.
Let's move on to a guy who certainly one of the all-time legendary greats, legendary tough guys, had his fair share of world championships himself. But in 1965, there's something bizarre that happened with Harley Race. Can you expand on that, Mick?
Harley Race is he's more a tag team wrestler at this point in 1965 in the AWA. He would occasionally wrestle singles matches. They would split him and Larry Hennig apart on a card, but Harley was primarily tag team. So in 1965, we talked about this before on the podcast, and there's Harley back in the day. And again, that's when he was teaming up with Larry Hennig. You look at Harley Race there, and the first thing that comes to your mind is not necessarily one of the toughest guys that ever lived in the business, but he was. Harley is having lunch at a place called the Chestnut Tree, a restaurant about 2 blocks from the Minneapolis Auditorium in downtown Minneapolis. And a woman is being accosted by 2 men. They're kind of slapping her up. And Harley gets up and intervenes, knocks one guy out with a one punch, and then gets stabbed in the back by party number 2. Luckily, the angle of the knife going in literally just missed doing some real damage, either to a heart or lung or what have you. But Harley is continuing to fight with the knife in his back. He's scheduled to wrestle that night at the Minneapolis Auditorium. Obviously, they pulled him from the show. The interesting thing about this is that the next time Harley appeared on television, the The fans cheered him like he was a hero, returning hero. Marty O'Neill put him over. And then as soon as the bell rang and Harley went back to his heel tactics with Larry Hennig, all was forgotten. And all of a sudden, he was Harley Race, the notorious bad guy again. But talk about the legend of Harley Race, knocking a couple of guys out, going to the aid of a woman, and he's fighting with a knife in his back. And that, again, 1965.
So, in 1965, and even going back to 1960, at the advent of the AWA, Verne Gagne was he was the top promoter, but he wasn't alone. Another guy, let's see, how much are you weigh? What is your name? But Wally Carbo was instrumental. How instrumental was Wally to Verne? I know they were partners, but were they equal partners? How much of a power broker was Verne himself versus the inclusion of Wally?
And I want you to ask how much of a power broker are you in Wally's voice?
How much a power broker are you? I'm
not quite sure that's how it would have got. A lot of us in there, but that might have been just Wally trying to put a thought together.
Exactly.
How much of a power a toe? Verne was establishing himself as a power. Let's just say this. His popularity was unmatched, and this includes Crusher back then. Going back to the 50s in Minneapolis, St. Paul, in the NWA territory, and then in the early 1960s, there he is. There's the businessman, Verne Gagne. Verne was slowly becoming that power broker. I think when it really came to fruition, Joe, was a little bit later on, probably early 1970s. He became more of an active, if not aggressive, participant in the AWA, in the backstage workings of the business. If you would go into the wrestling office, even in the mid 1960s, you had Wally's desk, you had Bill Casisto's desk, and you had Verne's desk. And it was like, you knew who was climbing and who wasn't. In terms of actual notoriety, when people knew Verne Gagne was the big deal, I'd say probably in the 70s when they started putting up on television, executive producer Verne Gagne. Now, to the layman, what is executive producer? Nobody knows the ins and outs of production, certainly the way you do, Joe. But to see that on the screen, to the average wrestling fan, hey, wait a second. If this guy's the executive producer, how come he can't just make a match with him and Mad Dog Vachon? How come this, that, and the other thing? So even though they were acknowledging that Verne was executive producer, that was just of TV, and Wally was still the promoter in the AWA.
So in 1965, when there was, shall we say, a dispute, was Wally appearing on TV during that time already?
He was. The fines and suspensions had already started to come out. Wally was a regular, as was Bill Casisto. I mentioned Bill. Bill was the quiet guy. Bill was an ex-wrestler and referee, and he was called the matchmaker when they would bring him out on TV. Bill was an office guy. He was a right-hand man. He wasn't the matchmaker. Wally was, and Verne, certainly. But it was such an interesting dynamic back then. And I've mentioned this before. One of the first times I went to the Dyckman Hotel as a kid, 6th floor, I get off the elevator and I open up the door, and down the hall on 605 Dyckman Hotel, I hear Wally yelling at Verne, fuck it, Verne, that's a lousy idea. So I'm not sure that Verne had completely taken over the reins back then. But yeah, Wally appeared on TV all the time, promoting the matches and, setting up the feuds. And, even the thing with Ivan Putski and the How Much You Weigh, or, that was, 1970s. But Wally was kind of doing the same thing with the Mighty Igor in 1965 when, Igor played the dumb Polak, pardon the expression, sitting in the front row in his trench coat in 95 degrees in the summertime. And who is this guy? Wally was also the interpreter for Igor, to us, in a manner of speaking. But yeah, Wally was TV present.
Was Wally a partner in the AWA from the very beginning?
Wally, and again, I'm not the expert on this. I know there are authorities out there that know the inner workings of that. Wally, to my knowledge, Wally and Verne were equal partners, going probably from the inception of the AWA, maybe a little bit further than that. The Stecker brothers, Tony Stecker, Dennis Stecker, they were the original power brokers here in the Twin Cities area. Wally took over from the Stecker family, and then Verne slowly, due to his popularity, made his way up the ranks.
And I do have it on good authority that a lot of those deals were brokered in a living room.
I think they were tear filled. They were tear filled, and they were emotional, and
One other question about the front office, shall we say, but in 1965, was Stanley Blackburn involved? I mean, by the way, Stanley was real. He didn't really have any authority in the AWA, but was Stanley Blackburn even a thing in 1965?
You would ask me that. I'm trying to remember the exact dates that Stanley got involved. I know that the AWA early on had a promoter, Les Ruffin, Ruffen, and Les, I believe, was based out of Indianapolis. I wouldn't swear to it, but I vividly recall seeing in the programs AWA president Les Ruffin, and then all of a sudden Les is gone, and Stanley Blackburn makes his way into the the guy that's going to show up at the arena and get booed and hissed and everything else. But Les Ruffin originally, and Stanley Blackburn, I'd say Stanley was probably mid to late 60s. Not 100% on that.
So we were kind of talking about the advent, the Twins and the Vikings starting in 61, the AWA in 60, and, the North Stars later in the 60s. I know that Verne liked a lot of, crossed over with a lot of professional athletes. I'm going to put up a picture here because I absolutely have so many questions.
I know which one you're talking about.
Why the hell are you playing baseball or softball in your tights?
I'll tell you why, Chris Tubbs, because you're the average guy on the street. You got to have a full uniform. You got to be covered up with pads and everything else. If you're Verne Gagne, if you're a professional wrestler and you slide into second base, you don't care if you're spiked or what have you. You don't care. And that's why you expose all the body parts. Reality.
Wow, that took a turn. But no, it just looks so odd to be in your wrestling gear playing a baseball game. I'm puzzled by it. I love what Verne did for the business. Mm-hmm. I'm just so puzzled by this. The swing looks good. Let me say that as a guy who covers Major League Baseball, that's a good looking swing. The form is good. Needs a little more clothing there.
Well, here's the deal. This is at Met Stadium in Bloomington, Minnesota. There's probably a lot of bald guys that attended Twins games. So in order to stand out from the rest of the bald guys in the crowd, Verne decided to wear his wrestling tights.
Makes sense.
So that would certainly draw a spotlight. The reality is this was a home run hitting contest, a celebrity home run hitting contest that the Twins put on before one of their games at Met Stadium. Verne was a participant, and Verne, I believe, actually won the home run hitting contest. Imagine that, loaded bat. The Crusher, on the other hand, came to the plate and tapped his bat on the plate, and the bat shattered. So Crusher, I believe, never got a chance actually to participate. So it's kind of like Joe Hennig, Curtis Axel, winning the Royal Rumble, never officially eliminated.
Yeah.
Crusher never got a chance to take a swing of the bat, and again, Verne went over. Imagine that.
Did Crusher step up to the plate in trunks as well?
You know, I don't. If oh, what a.
I mean,
It's a serious question. I know.
It is, but it's like, you know, if Verne did, and in that picture, besides the trunks, he had his fucking wrestling boots on. It's not like you can dig into the batter's box and
That's
get
true.
good footing in there.
Great point, Joe. Great point.
You know, you guys have such an eye for this stuff. I'm envious of you. You know, you're two astute sportscasters. I don't know if Crusher did go to the plate in his trunks. I'm not sure if he had a couple of beer kegs on his shoulders. The only picture that I know of that home run hitting contest featured Verne Gagne. That probably was the only one that Verne would allow to the media.
I'm gonna say, yeah, there's a reason for that.
Yeah, but that just and you mentioned Chris, the crossover. Verne loved getting involved with the other local sports teams.
Yeah, we saw a lot of Vikings. Like when I started watching, there was a lot of Vikings presence. And I mean, obviously the NFL and it just made sense. But yeah, to see it crossover with the Twins, 4 years into their existence, that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool.
In September of 1965, when the Twins won their first American League pennant, the Crusher, our good buddy, actually led a parade around the WTCN studios at one of the live TV tapings. I don't know if it was the exact day that the Twins clinched the pennant, but it was a Saturday, and Crusher had a little parade. He had some of the fans following him around ringside, and I believe he carried a Minnesota Twins pennant flag back in the day. So, and again, the AW always trying to cross over, A, because Verne loved the publicity, and why not? And B, if you can incorporate yourself with all the other legit sports in town, that's a good thing for your product.
Verne was a smart businessman.
Very much so.
Especially back in those days. Some may question some of those decisions in the mid to late 80s, but that's a whole nother story. Let's shift gears a little bit. We've talked about many stars and some feuds that happened during 1965, but let's bring up some other ones. Chris, if you just want to call up the photos, and then Mick and I will throw out some comments.
Absolutely. And again, I can't, the AWA is not drawn. The St. Paul Auditorium, they had a crowd of about 11,000 for Crusher and Bruiser and Hennig Race. But for the most part, the matches are drawing anywhere between 4,000 and 6,000, 7,000, I would say. And back in the day, that was good. 7,000, 8,000 people meant you were doing something right. Some of the guys that meant something back then. Again, here's Reggie Parks back in the day, and Reggie, of course, was Canadian, but he was billed from Melbourne, Australia. I don't know why. Reggie had a little bit of a French Canadian accent. He didn't have an Australian accent, but they thought Reg Parks sounded like an Aussie, so why not? Reggie had some main event matches with Mad Dog Vachon. Did not win the championship, and Reggie actually held Verne Gagne to a 20-minute draw on television. They brought the match back to the Minneapolis Auditorium, and of course, Verne went over. But Reggie, back in the day, big deal.
Did Reggie have the moniker "Man with a Cast Iron Stomach"? Was that
he
him?
did? Yeah, he absolutely did. He's the one that let the Volkswagen bus run over his stomach right behind the Calhoun Beach Hotel. I'm sure it was stripped down, but still, that's a hell of a lot of weight. And Reggie would just put a towel over his midsection and let the VW van go right across it. Yeah, man with the cast iron stomach.
And the next one is a longtime mainstay. You might not recognize him in that photo, but Mick, take it.
That is one John Lanza, Black Jack Lanza. At the time, he was Cowboy Jack Lanza. So this is 1965. I want to say Jack broke into the business in 62, 61. I wouldn't swear to it. So he had been around for a little while, but consummate baby face. Jack would come into the ring in the jean shorts, if you will, and
Which was
Jack
very
again,
popular in the 60s.
yeah, very very much so. But that's a baby faced cowboy Jack Lanza, and of course we know how that career progressed. Certainly bigger and better things were on the horizon for Jack. He was a mid card guy back in 1965.
When did he fully become Blackjack? Was that 70s?
I want to say it was prior to that, late 60s, 70s, something like that. But what a transformation. Jack had light brown hair, and then he went to the dark black shoe polish, as many guys would attest to after they wrestled Jack. Wilbur Snyder. Can't say enough about Wilbur Snyder. If you're a wrestling historian and you have followed this business back to the 1950s, Wilbur Snyder was one of the greats in wrestling. As a matter of fact, the AWA used to say he was one of the only men to ever defeat Verne Gagne. And that wasn't in Minneapolis, but Wilbur indeed defeated Verne. He was another carryover. Wilbur Snyder, his son wrestled for a while. Wilbur, by 1965, still a player in the AWA, and he came back into the 1970s. I believe he made an appearance in 1988. I think Wilbur made an appearance at the last AWA show at the Minneapolis Auditorium. So he was one of the greats. But again, now his star is just starting to diminish a little bit in 65.
So I'm looking at our notes, and the next one is a wrestler that I'm very familiar with and his manager, but it says, notice the name changes.
This is great. That's Chris Markoff on the left, our buddy Marty O'Neill, and Marty didn't even have sunglasses. That shows you how far back this goes. Marty hadn't even transitioned to the sunglasses back then. The guy on the right is Professor Steve Druck. And Steve Druck was Chris Markoff's manager, and he actually managed Harley Race for a while here in the AWA. Professor Druck, we showed a program a little bit earlier on called a Turkey Neck Main Event. That was where Professor Druck and Chris Markoff got involved with the Crusher in a main event. They actually stuck the Professor in there. He's a former wrestler, preliminary guy here in the AWA. As it relates to Chris Markoff and the name changes, I'm looking last night at results for the AWA in 1965. And there's that Turkey Neck Main Event. And you'll notice that welcome to the new home of pro wrestling, it was the convention center. This was the first show at the Minneapolis Convention Center, which was adjacent to the Minneapolis Auditorium. They hadn't torn the auditorium down, and it was still used for wrestling, but every once in a while, right next door at the convention center, they would run wrestling shows. So this was the christening of that. But to the Chris Markoff name changes, I looked, and in a period of probably 2-3 months, Chris Markoff appeared in the Twin Cities as Harry Madison. That's right, Harry Madison, good old Harry Madison. Chris Popovich. Yeah, Chris Popovich. And then Chris Markoff. Now, I don't know where he was billed from as Harry Madison. I'm not sure where he was billed from as Chris Popovich, but Chris Markoff was from Skokie, Yugoslavia. And then, of course, eventually later on, he became The Russians Is Coming, the Ahia. And but this was just so interesting to me because here's a guy, folks, it's the same guy. You just saw him last week and the week before, and he went from Madison to Popovich to Markoff to, Tom, Dick, and Harry. Well, he was already Harry Madison, Uh, but that's wrestling fans, God bless them. They just didn't. He probably had a different set of trucks on, like
Well,
Clark Kent puts the glasses on, you don't know who he is.
and they did that because they could.
Absolutely. Yep.
Next one, let's take a walk on the wild side.
Oh.
Shall we say, let's go to the Pompous.
Where is he? Look at him. Look at him. There he is right there, the guy that eventually became part of the U.S. Postal Service, which, of course, gives new meaning to the phrase going postal. Pompero Firpo, filing the teeth. Pompero, we mentioned before on the podcast, had appeared in the Minneapolis territory. I wouldn't say the AWA, in the late 1950s as Ivan the Terrible. And he came back mid 1960s as Pompero Firpo, the Wild Bull of the Pampas. And he was the consummate heel back then. He was Mad Dog Vachon with hair. Let's put it that way. And of course, he came out, it is I, it is me, and his primary feud was with the Crusher, who used to accuse Firpo of coming to the ring with lice and lizards and mice and everything else in his hair. And Crusher wanted Pompero's hair defumigated before he would get into the ring with him. They eventually wrestled in a cage match in Minneapolis. And of course, wonder of wonders, Crusher went over.
The next one on the list, I don't recall or I'm not familiar with. I'm guessing by his name, he might have had a cowboy gimmick. I'm looking forward to seeing the picture, but it's Tex McKenzie.
All 6'9", and that was legit.
Wow.
Tex McKenzie. He had wrestled extensively in the United States, all over the country. When he left the AWA, he actually made a big splash out east, working in on the East Coast, Johnny Powers promotion, so on and so forth. So Tex, and into Detroit too. He was a mainstay. Tex McKenzie was a guy who they brought in, big cowboy. He had originally wrestled as Dakota Mack, but they built him out of Texas. And he had a pretty decent run here in the AWA for a while. As a matter of fact, Tex McKenzie, talking about Pompero Firpo, at the height of Firpo's run here in the AWA, Tex McKenzie beat him in 4 seconds at the Minneapolis Auditorium. Bell rang and Bulldog headlock, and there he was. And Tex McKenzie went over. Teamed up with another great wrestler, Cowboy Bob Ellis, here in the Twin Cities area. Tex, not along for the ride for a long time, but he made an impact here in '65.
So I guess we're going to go from Cowboys to Indians. And if that's, I don't mean anything derogatory, but Billy Red Cloud. I remember Billy Red Cloud.
Billy Red Cloud had the personality, Joe, of grass growing.
Yeah.
He could not deliver a promo to save his soul. He was originally Bill Wright, Wright, from Minneapolis. I think he attended Roosevelt High School, if I'm not mistaken. But he was a journeyman wrestler. And in the mid-1960s, I believe this was legitimate Indian heritage or Native American heritage. They did a full ceremony where Bill Wright became Billy Red Cloud, tremendously popular. He also had a feud with Mad Dog Vachon. They had some Indian chain matches here. He teamed up, obviously, it was a Made in Heaven, teamed up a little bit later on with Wahoo McDaniel. Billy Red Cloud, for all his lack of personality, was over huge here. Sadly, he passed away. He had some serious heart issues, leaky heart valve, and we lost him, I believe, in the early to middle 1970s.
Wow. I didn't know it was that early.
Yeah.
Next is a tag team. And I know you've talked about these two extensively on prior podcasts. Larry Hyniemi and Gene Anderson.
It's interesting that they did not team up here in the AWA. Larry Hyniemi, of course, became one of the Anderson brothers when he went out to the Mid-Atlantic territory. Gene Anderson was a legit tough guy. And he was from the state of Minnesota, I believe South St. Paul, and he was a state wrestler.
That's my hometown, baby.
Well, can't have everything perfect, but Gene Anderson was a legit tough guy. As I said, state champion in wrestling, got into the pros, and he was not over here as anything other than basically a mid-card enhancement guy, which is really surprising. Larry Heinemi's debut was in 1965, trained by Verne Gagne. And of course, when he got his niche in the business, really found it, is when he went down to, again, the Mid Atlantic area and into the NWA. And Gene and Lars Anderson, now at this point, became part of that legendary Anderson family. But as a matter of fact, when Larry broke in here, Larry Heinemi, he wrestled Gene Anderson a couple of times to open up shows here in the Twin Cities area. There they are. That is the early Lars Anderson, Larry Heinemi on the left from St. Cloud, Minnesota, and Gene Anderson on the right. Tough guys.
Yes, I'm guessing Crusher and Bruiser sent them packing. The next photo, I don't know who. I've never heard of George Catalina Drake.
Interesting story about George Drake. And here's a little aside. He actually appeared on an episode of Superman. The George Reeves original character Superman, George Catalina Drake. He was another journeyman wrestler. He didn't have a lot of great success in the AWA. He was one of these guys, Joe. I would liken him to plus Buddy Lane type wrestler.
Okay.
He would always give a good account of himself on television, wrestled on a lot of the house shows around the AWA. They billed him, of course, out of Catalina Beach, California, George Drake. Every once in a while, they would put him in some kind of a winning capacity, like they would do with a George Gadasky or a Kenny J, and let him get a victory over a Harley Race or a Larry Hennig or something like that. He was an accomplished veteran, great guy. From what our friend Dixie Jordan, Princess Little Cloud tells me, George Drake was one of the nicest guys you would ever want to meet. Sadly, passed away many years ago, but again, 1965, a regular with the AWA.
We had talked about some name changes with Markoff. The next guy, Sergeant Rene Jacques Pepe Le Pew Goulet.
You said it all. Our good buddy Bob Bridard out of Canada, who we lost just a few years ago. That is early Rene Goulet. I believe that's a publicity shot from 1963. Rene came into the Twin Cities area as kind of a Rick Martel babyface. He was billed out of Nice, France. Started a feud with the Crusher. Crusher was still a notorious heel in the AWA at that point that Rene got in, but into the mid 1960s, Rene, and into the late 1960s, Rene, a beloved babyface here, never won any championships, but they, again, the kind of guy that they would team him up maybe with an Eddie Sharkey on television, give him a one-fall victory over Larry Hennig and Harley Race. But Rene eventually went, he was Canadian, French Canadian, but he adopted the Sergeant Jacques Goulet persona from the French Foreign Legion. I don't know if he actually was in the French Foreign Legion or if he ate at some French restaurant in the Twin Cities and decided to change his name. But Rene was, we've talked about him, consummate professional, big-time babyface here.
You brought up our friend Eddie Sharkey. I'm looking at our notes, but he had quite the feud with Danny Hodge, who, by the way, could crush an apple with his hand.
Danny Hodge could tear apart players legitimately with his bare hands. Eddie Sharkey, God bless Eddie. He's still around, alive and kicking, one of our favorite people in the whole world. Eddie Sharkey and a guy named Bob Boyer had a series of matches that went to several draws here in the Twin Cities. 20 minutes maybe, then they go to a half hour, give them a 45-minute time limit, whatever, with the idea that the winner would get a shot at the AWA junior heavyweight champion, Danny Hodge. And Bob Boyer, I believe, won the pivotal match with Eddie, lost to Danny Hodge, as did Eddie Sharkey. When Danny came into the territory with all this buildup, you're anticipating that maybe they're going to give Eddie Sharkey a short run with the championship. They did not. They put Danny Hodge over. And I talked to Danny several years ago at Cauliflower Alley Club. And mind you, Danny Hodge, one of the greatest wrestlers ever. And he said, working with Eddie Sharkey was a pleasure. It was a night off. One of the smoothest and most technically gifted wrestlers I've ever had the pleasure of being in the ring with. Doesn't get better than that.
I mean, we got to wrap things up because we're just over an hour already. But there's no denying, there's no mistaking the historical importance of the AWA, not only to professional wrestling, but I got to say to the Twin Cities.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
In the Twin Cities, and we get knocked on this podcast all the time for something or other, but a lot of people have said, hey, why are you so Twin Cities based? There were other AWA cities. We do our best to make mention of the fact, we'll say it was around the Horn or it happened in Chicago, but it typically, the catalyst, the start was here on television, and that's why we always refer to the Twin Cities. But the AWA, yes, and 1965 with the title changes and the roster, pivotal year for the AWA.
Franchise idea. We can be AWA Unleashed. Somebody wants to do AWA Unleashed Chicago? Have at it. Just pay us the franchise fee. Don't be a slacker.
That will go over as well as our other merch sales.
Every now and then.
You mean, you know what? Yeah, there's never a now. It's always then. Let's wrap it up with some shout outs here, guys, and then take it home. So, Mick, I'm going to let you go ahead and kick it off.
Our buddy Doug Frazee. Is there a more loyal guy to our podcast? I mean, he is just such a super guy. And I'm not saying this because he sent me a copy of my old Body Slams and Pinfalls DVD unsolicited in the mail the other day. I couldn't find my copy of it. But Doug is so loyal to the cause. One of our great fans, Patreon member, Doug Frazee.
My shout out, I figured it was just appropriate. My shout out is going to go to the Gagne family, in particular Verne, Aladdin, Greg, his sisters, even the grandchildren, but the Gagne family, because without Verne, and by extension the family, we wouldn't be doing this podcast. Right. There is no AWA. So to Verne and the Gagne family, thank you very much.
Yeah, because they were very pivotal. I mean, like you said, Joe, I mean, right on. Without the Gagnes, we wouldn't be able to do this. Yep. My shout out's going to go out to our friend Phil Fesky, who I met at Waterloo. And I think, Mick, you met him at Waterloo for the first time a couple of years ago. Just a big supporter, professional wrestling, supporter of the podcast. Currently battling kidney cancer. Saw that he's currently laid up and going through some things. So, Phil, you're gonna get through this. You are gonna get through this. Yep. You are gonna kick out. Cancer is gonna do the job, and we will see you in Waterloo sooner rather than later. So just keep Phil in your thoughts and prayers, and we are rooting for you, my friend. And you will kick out of this. You will. Anything else, you guys?
No.
Well, I want to say thanks to Mick for being so old that he can remember 1965, because without him, I wouldn't have gotten all of this information about the year that I was born.
And you know what? That was 10 years before I was born. How you feel now, Mick?
Huh?